Private investigators or those who've hired one. What's your best story or most interesting find? Story 1. A social media influencer known for her fitness and travel content hired me to find out who was impersonating her online. Someone was creating fake profiles, posting explicit content, and even sending harassing messages to her followers. She was terrified. I started by tracking IP addresses and digital footprints. It led me to a rival influencer, a woman who was obsessed with my client's lifestyle. The rival influencer had hired a team of hackers to create the fake profiles and spread the malicious content. She was trying to ruin my client's reputation and take her followers. The rival was also using deepfake technology to create very realistic videos. I had to work with cybersecurity experts to gather evidence and shut down the fake profiles. The case was intense and disturbing, but we eventually exposed the rival and brought her to justice. Story 2. I'm a private fire investigator. I found an Elmo doll, tightly bound and covered in white paint, in the basement of a vacant building in a distressed part of town. I'll find the pictures in a moment. It's surprising how much adult material people have. Elderly women, local men, middle-aged mothers, everyone seems to have a lot of it. I once had a man admit to intentionally setting his house on fire, simply because I was friendly to him. It was quite clear he was responsible, and he knew I'd figured it out. But I just talked to him about sports and other casual topics, and right before I left, he confessed. I had a fish tank break near a power strip, causing a fire that I extinguished. The family couldn't understand why their house was so warm, since the fire started in the basement and they hadn't seen it. I had a man tell me that the church across the street would gather in the street and pray his house would burn down. It turned out the tenant's boyfriend was responsible for the fire, not a divine intervention as one church member claimed. One young woman offered to watch her roommate's dog for the weekend, then became irritated by its barking and set it on fire. She is the most genuinely malicious person I've ever encountered. I had a firearm pointed at me at a fire scene, which was incredibly alarming. A man was complaining outside the house that a woman had told the police he had set it, while I was inside, frozen in place, afraid to reveal my presence. I waited for a car to pass to provide some noise, then quickly exited through the front door. He came around the front of the house, firearm drawn, and aimed it at my vehicle as I finally drove away. I called the police, and they told me to simply avoid returning, which was not very helpful. Being in dark rooms tends to make your imagination run wild, especially when there are fatalities involved. Story 3. Not a private investigator, but have hired multiple of them for my job. I'm a work comp adjuster, so putting surveillance on people that you think may be faking it or not sticking within their restrictions is not unheard of. Not used nearly as much as you'd think, and you rarely if ever get the reports you'd imagine. The best ones you'd find would be people claiming they have terrible back injuries and unable to do anything and then find them out doing manual yard labor or whatever. But the most interesting one was a guy who had an alleged shoulder injury. Every time he was about to be placed at MMI, maximum medical improvement, his alleged pain would increase substantially. The way he injured the shoulder was questionable, as he claimed it was from lifting a 5-number box. We put surveillance on him, but never found anything. Then randomly one day the Department of Insurance got an anonymous letter with pictures of this guy claiming he was doing home renovations, and had pictures to prove it all. It looked like the work of a private investigator, but it was all anonymous and got so much more than what the professional did. Our guess was it was a pissed-off coworker of the claimant's, because this same claimant had a prior claim with an altercation with another coworker. Story 4. I am not a private investigator, but I am an investigator working for a nonprofit agency, and I investigate allegations of mistreatment and neglect on behalf of people with disabilities. I was assigned a case late last year which seemed like a quick, straightforward matter. A house supervisor reported that they conducted a safety exercise on a Thursday morning, and during this safety exercise one of the residents in the house apparently pushed over another resident, causing a cut on their lip and bruises on their side. My task was to determine whether or not a safety exercise was conducted and whether these injuries were sustained as they were reported. Once I started asking questions, I realized this was much more complex than I thought. Out of 5 staff I spoke with, they all denied anything happened. They claimed that they were on shift, however they could not tell me a single detail of the day. They confirmed there was a safety exercise, but couldn't remember who else was there, if any injuries occurred, what time it happened, what the weather was like, what time they finished their shift, nothing. It was incredibly frustrating, because nobody would give me any information. Finally, I received an anonymous call from one of the staff members that was there that morning with information about a staff member who physically harmed the injured resident earlier in the week, and that the safety exercise was a completely fabricated event used to explain the injuries from the harm which happened a few days earlier. There was also a staff member who was out on family medical leave who happened to be at the house when the harm happened, and she documented all of the injuries on a body check form, which is required whenever we discover new marks. She saved copies of all of these body checks with photos that had timestamps to verify they were taken days before the alleged safety exercise. She is truly the champion in all of this. I was able to prove that the injuries were sustained earlier in the week and not during this safety exercise. I was then able to confirm with the security company that no safety exercise was performed on the morning they alleged. In order for one of our group homes to perform a safety exercise, they must notify the security alert company so they can take the system offline. They must notify the police and fire department, so they know that it is a drill and they do not send a vehicle out. After the exercise is complete, they then have to call the security, fire and police to let them know the exercise is over. I checked the phone records and no calls were made that morning. The security company gave me a print out of the activity for the day and showed how there is no possible way that they activated the alarm. The house supervisor and the perpetrator even went on to say that the alarm was down, so a technician went out there and verified there were no issues with the alarm system. This is by far the most upsetting case I've ever worked on. Story 5. Not a private investigator, have a short story about one. I live at the end of a cul-de-sac. From the edge of the circle, there is a spillway that lets water drain out to the main street, which runs perpendicular to my house. No one parks on the main street because it is walled off to enter the complex. One day, this dude pulls up in a black car, parks across the street from the spillway, and just sits there for hours. Since this is not normal activity in the neighborhood, everyone is immediately suspicious. He eventually leaves after doing nothing but sitting in his car all day, so we all just forget about it until the next day he comes back and does the same damn thing. Someone finally called the cops and they came to suss out what he was up to. Turns out he was a private investigator casing someone in the complex. Cops told him to move it along. He was making the residents nervous. Dude was not very good at his job since his arrival and subsequent non-activity only served to make him extremely conspicuous. Story 6. Our company frequently uses a specialized service for in-depth background checks, particularly for senior-level positions like vice presidents. One individual we hired turned out to be a kind of temporary boost employee. He was a productive worker with valuable ideas, but he wasn't a good fit for leadership roles. Initially, things would improve significantly, but after about a year, he'd be asked to step down. Further investigation revealed that his leadership style was so uninvolved that his team essentially lost motivation to work. Another applicant had an incredibly unusual situation. He shared the exact same name, birth date, and birth hospital as someone who had been involved in a serious legal case in Texas. As part of the IT department, I'm not normally privy to this information. However, the way these sensitive documents were submitted kept triggering our email security system. So we in IT had to verify that the files were safe and legitimate. And, naturally, I did take a look at the content. Story 7. Not a private investigator, but hired a few for insurance fraud. This one guy was amazing because he was one of those adults who looks like he's 18 up until he's 35. One claimant was running a window tinting business out of his garage while off work for his injury. Private investigator hired him to tint his car windows and told him, "My camera's acting up, so I'm going to sit over here and try to fix it while you tint the windows." Footage was amazing. Another time he followed a claimant to a local festival and saw him dancing around. He went over and told him he was filming people for a high school class project and asked if he could get video of him dancing. The guy happily agreed. Story 8. I know it sounds ridiculous, but my prized garden gnome, Norman, vanished. He wasn't just any gnome. He was a limited edition, hand-painted masterpiece. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had always been a bit envious of my garden, and I had a sneaking suspicion she was involved. So I hired a private investigator. I told him, "Just find Norman, no questions asked." A week later, he called me. "Ma'am, I found your gnome." It was a wild goose chase. Apparently, Mrs. Henderson had indeed taken Norman, but not for the reason I thought. Her grandson, a budding YouTuber, had convinced her to borrow him for a prank video. He'd created this elaborate story about Norman being a traveling gnome, secretly filming him at different locations around town. The private investigator had tracked the grandson's social media, identified the locations, and retrieved Norman from a local park, where he was posing for a sunset shot. The private investigator even sent me a link to the video. It was actually kind of funny. I ended up returning the video link to Mrs. Henderson, and we had a good laugh. I still keep a very close eye on Norman, though. Story 9. I was hired by a wife, let's call her Lisa, who suspected her husband, Mark, was cheating. Standard stuff, right? But Mark was a tech CEO, always traveling, always on his phone. I started surveillance and quickly realized it wasn't just one affair. It was a whole network. Mark was leading a double life. He had multiple apartments, multiple identities, and multiple partners in different cities. He was using encrypted messaging apps and burner phones. I followed him to a secret office, which turned out to be a high-end escort service. He wasn't just cheating. He was running a complex operation. He even had a separate, fully furnished apartment where he'd take the women. It was like a movie. Lisa was devastated, but she also felt vindicated. We gathered all the evidence, and she filed for divorce. The legal battle was intense, but she got a significant settlement. It was one of the most complex and bizarre cases I've ever worked on. Story 10. My great-uncle, a reclusive millionaire, passed away, leaving his entire estate to a long-lost relative. The lawyer had no clue who this was. All he knew was the name Rosie. My family was baffled. We hired a private investigator to track down this mysterious Rosie. The private investigator started with genealogical records, then moved to social media, and eventually he found her. Rosie turned out to be a former circus performer who had briefly worked with my great-uncle decades ago. They had a short, intense affair, and she had a child, who was the heir. The private investigator found Rosie living in a small town, running a vintage clothing shop. She had no idea about the inheritance. It was a wild story, and it completely changed her life. She used the money to expand her business and travel the world. My family was initially upset, but we eventually accepted it. It was a reminder that life can be full of surprises. Story 11. I used to do background checks for employment. The funniest one was a guy who was working for a large provincial hydro company. He relied solely on GPS. He had to drive to a remote site a few hundred kilometers away. The next day, the crew were waiting on him. Finally, the foreman, the person giving the reference, calls to see when he would arrive. The applicant answered sleepily and said his GPS signal stopped about 250 kilometers in, and he just turned around and went home. Didn't call anyone, use a map, just went home. He also used to take a little boat pretending to survey sites. Several times he was caught sleeping, just floating around in the boat. The most surprising thing, he got the promotion he was seeking. Story 12. My grandmother lost her wedding ring, a family heirloom, and she was heartbroken. She searched everywhere, but it was gone. We hired a private investigator, thinking it might have been stolen. He started by interviewing everyone who had been in the house, including the cleaning lady, the gardener, and the delivery guy. He even checked the trash, but he found nothing. Then he decided to check the garden again, this time using a metal detector, and there it was, buried under a rose bush. Apparently, my grandmother had been gardening and accidentally dropped it. She was so relieved, she cried. The private investigator wouldn't even take payment. He said it was the most heartwarming case he'd ever worked on. Story 13. I was running a small tech startup with a partner, and things were going well, or so I thought. Then, I started noticing discrepancies in our financial reports. Large sums of money were unaccounted for, and my partner's behavior had changed. He was evasive and secretive. Hired a private investigator to investigate. They uncovered a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. My partner had been systematically embezzling funds, diverting company resources to his personal accounts. The private investigator provided me with detailed financial records and evidence of his fraudulent activities. It was a devastating blow, but thanks to the private investigator's work, I was able to take legal action and recover a significant portion of the stolen funds. It saved my company from complete ruin. Story 14. The time this guy noticed me and started following me. It was actually good evidence because I just started recording the speed and maneuvers we were doing as he followed me. He had his young child with him, and it was a custody case. I lost him by running a yellow light at a busy intersection I was familiar with and knew how to navigate. The guy was not a good parent from what I observed. Most enjoyable was exposing a workers' compensation deception. The guy recognized my car. I was there a lot over a long time, so I used another car. Then it turned out the neighbor of the subject I was observing in front of owned his own business, and disliked how high his insurance was thanks to fraudulent claims, and just let me use his carport. He'd hang out with me. We'd sit and chat. Investigative work is often very slow, and he'd provide drinks and snacks as we hid behind the woodpile or a car. I was sad when that job ended. Used to tell my boss how challenging it was, but I was persevering like a good employee. Almost as fun was when we had to follow this unfaithful spouse to the beach in Florida. Got paid to go relax in a nice beach town all day and night. Didn't get a lot of sleep thanks to having to be up gathering video evidence after they went to sleep / during the night / before they got up, as well as having to drive while they flew, but it by far beat the normal jobs. What's surprising is the daughter was able to obtain information from the guy online and get more evidence. He had a very simple password on a dating website, so we could see everything he was saying and planning. What's sad is people being unfaithful, and they have to know their partner suspects them, but they keep doing it even though their partner asks for separation and they refuse. And the unfaithful person is better off financially if they'd go ahead and leave, and there's no children. No one is happy, but they just keep going. What was frustrating was just conclusively proving someone's infidelity, and then the client goes and reconciles with them, has intimacy or just shares the same residence, and invalidates all of our work. The law is infidelity evidence only counts if the offended party does not reconcile with them / has intimacy with them / cohabitates with them. Had to go find some guy out in a rural area one time. The whole road he lived on was his family. There was no place / no way to set up and observe him without immediate suspicion. And these weren't friendly people. Told my boss she could terminate my employment if she wanted. I'm not getting harmed or attacked over such a risky assignment. She tried it out the next night and agreed. Story 15. My fiancé and I were planning our wedding, and everything seemed perfect. But I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He was spending a lot of time away from home, and his phone was constantly buzzing with messages. I hired a private investigator to investigate. They'd uncovered evidence of an affair, not just a casual fling, but a serious relationship. The private investigator provided me with photos and videos of my fiancé with another woman. It was devastating, but I'm glad I found out before the wedding. I called off the engagement, and while it was painful, I knew I made the right decision. Story 16. A wealthy client hired me to investigate the disappearance of her late father's art collection. He'd left a will specifying that the collection should be divided among his 3 children, but when they went to retrieve it, it was gone. I started by interviewing the family members and the estate lawyer. It turned out the youngest sibling, a struggling artist, had taken the collection and sold it on the black market. He'd been desperate for money and saw it as his only option. He even forged documents to make it look like the collection had been stolen. The family was devastated, but they decided to press charges. It was a messy situation, and it highlighted the complexities of family dynamics. Story 17. I was conducting surveillance on a suspected cheating spouse, following him to a secret rendezvous. I'd staked out the location, a small, unassuming motel, and was waiting for him to emerge. After a few hours, I saw him leave, accompanied by a woman. I followed them to a restaurant, taking photos and notes. Then I realized I'd made a crucial mistake. I had been following the wrong car. The man I was observing was a completely different person. My client's husband had left the motel much earlier, and I'd missed him entirely. It was an embarrassing blunder, but it taught me a valuable lesson. Double-check your target. Story 18. I was adopted as a baby, and I'd always wondered about my birth parents. As I got older, the desire to know my roots grew stronger. I hired a private investigator who specialized in genealogical research. They started with the limited information I had from my adoption records and began piecing together my family history. It was a long and challenging process, but the private investigator was persistent. They tracked down my birth father, who was living in another state. He had no idea I existed. We connected, and it was an emotional reunion. He was a kind and gentle man, and we quickly formed a close bond. The private investigator's work gave me a sense of belonging and filled a void in my life. Story 19. My dad caused a car accident when I was little, rear-ended a guy stopped around a blind curve. The guy claimed back injury and sued for some crazy amount, like $300,000 or something. Not sure if my dad hired a private investigator or did it himself, I was 5-ish. But got the dude on film lifting 50-pound boxes at his workplace. He died of unrelated causes shortly after, and the lawsuit got thrown out. Story 20. I worked for a private investigator many years ago. Normally, we were hired by companies to watch employees suspected of insurance fraud. I've seen people build brand new additions, onto their house with a hurt back, or play 18 holes of golf every day for a week with the same hurt back. Once, we watched a very boring man for a week. He did nothing more than run simple errands, such as getting gas, go to the grocery store, the bank, and the post office. Finally, after a very dull week of watching this guy, he suddenly packs his car up. We followed him for a bit and realized this was not a simple errand. We ended up following all the way from near Houston, Texas to New Orleans, Louisiana. Turns out he'd rented a French Quarter room for the next week. I was paid to follow this guy through all of the clubs in the French Quarter for that week, while drinking as part of my cover. Because we had no chance to grab our things from the hotel, we purchased new clothes from a nearby Walmart and Bourbon Street tourist wear. Best week on the job ever.
That's a wrap for this video. Make sure to leave your relatable story down in the comments. I would love to make a video on them. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.